Winning New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman frequently quotes Heather in his books and columns and describes her as the oasis when it comes to insights into the future of work. Heather's mission is to help employees and leaders alike prepare for and adapt to jobs that do not yet exist. Please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker and the co-author of the recently released book, The Adaptation Advantage, Heather McGowan.
Thank you, Jim, for that warm introduction, and I will try my best to live up to that, the expectations you set there. I'm going to share with you, using a number of visuals, a talk that's going to take you through some of the core elements that Chris and I put into this book. So first, I'm going to give you the key points of the book, which I'm going to thread throughout the talk. The first of which is the future work, which is really the now of work, is about rapid learning, unlearning, and adaptation. In order to do this, we have to let go of not only the way we've always done it, but equally, if not more difficult, who we think we are. Leading in this new normal requires we become comfortable with ambiguity and vulnerability to lead what is now going to be learning tours filled with the unknown and sometimes the unknown unknowns, just like this moment we've been in for now, officially a year this week. I've organized the talk as follows. I'm going to start by talking about the pandemic. It's the elephant in the room we've all been dealing with. And I have some news that I think is quite good around this. It's caused an acceleration. You're using a 5-year timeline to talk about things. I think we've been through 5 years in the last year, and I'll explain to you why. And I want to talk about how superbly we've adapted and what that indicates for the future for all of us. Next, I'm going to talk about how we're going through this acceleration in the in time, where we're moving from analog and connected to digital and hyper-connected. And then I'm going to talk about what this means to our identities. We're moving from an individual fixed occupational identity to a mindset of adaptation and continuous transformation. I'm going to talk about what this means for leadership. We're moving from leaders who are these unquestioned experts who lead from the top down simply to drive productivity, to leaders that focus more on helping ignite the passions of their workers to create them to be more self-propelled. And so I call that bottom-up to inspired potential. And then we're going to talk about where do we go from here? And I think the road ahead is the human capital era, where the greatest investment anyone can make is in a human. Over technology, real estate, anything. The humans are the ones that are creating the value, and I'll explain to you why I think that is. So let's start off. I want to understand what you folks are thinking. So I'm going to start with a poll. We're going to have polls throughout this. I think we have 4 on this in this particular talk. The first one, we're going to talk about what did you learn through the pandemic? So Jamie, if we could launch that poll. So what have you learned through the global pandemic so far? Hopefully we're nearing the end of that. First, you can select you like remote working more than you thought you would. My teams are blowing me away. I prefer to work face-to-face, and this is not working, which may be true for some folks. Some of you may not have had the opportunity to work remote at all, or none of the above. And so I'm going to give us, maybe 15 more seconds to see where folks land. It looks like right now that folks are saying that they like remote work a lot more than they thought they would. That's so far the #1 answer. Some folks are seeing opportunities they didn't see before, and many of you are finding your teams are blowing you away. But it looks like far and above, it looks like, and by the way, these polls are all anonymous. So you can say whatever you think in any of these polls. I think it's helpful to see what other folks are thinking without the pressure of having everyone know that it's you. So I think we can, Jamie, we can stop it there and move on. It looks like if the #1 answer was more of you like remote work, a lot more than you thought you would. That's good. So let's talk about, we're going through the greatest velocity of change in human history, and it's primarily driven by technology, where every step forward, it's what's called exponential. Every step forward is double the prior step. And human adaptation is linear, is a series of sequential steps. So the tension you see between that gray and the black line is our struggle to adapt. And so something happened, now it's officially a year ago, when I declared that the coronavirus would be the greatest accelerant to business transformation in history. I was just guessing at the time, but some data has come out that's really interesting, which is why I suggest we've moved through 5 years in the last year. McKinsey found in the first 60 days since we went into lockdown, since we transformed so quickly in work, learning, and healthcare, we really leapt forward 5 years in our transformation to digital. Accenture says we were about 20% into the migration to the cloud, with the remaining 80% they thought would take about a decade. We're now on track to do that in 5 years or fewer. And the recent data from the World Economic Forum finds that we may be handing off as much as 50% of our work tasks to technology by just 2025. So we really have gone through at least 5 years in the last year, many of that happening really quickly. It has been an acceleration. And one of the things I paid attention to early in the process was how quickly we transformed around who works, what we do, how we do it, and where we do it. So if the center of this is BC, before coronavirus, in the first 2 weeks, a lot of this happened in the first 2 weeks. Everybody who could work from home, learn online, see a doctor from home, or suddenly dine outdoors did it. Restaurants changed, universities changed, and corporations changed. For some folks, work became dangerous, and we became more aware of the folks who put themselves in harm's way every day for us. And now there's conversations about maybe we need a GI Bill for these folks that came out in the New York Times today. We need to think about how we move more folks out of these harmful positions. Everybody's had to rework a process, whether it's a supply chain or a product line. Many folks had to pivot product lines, particularly early in the pandemic when we had shortages, and now through the vaccine process, other folks are pivoting product lines. Any parent out there is also a teacher, particularly of school-age children. My heart goes out to you. You are doing a Herculean effort to carry a generation forward, and frankly, we're not doing enough for you. It's disproportionately falling on women, and there's an opportunity for us to make even more changes. Leaders who I see are doing really well right now are doing so with establishing trust and psychological safety, something we're going to talk about quite a bit in the leadership section. So if you look at this collectively, people say to me all the time, when are we going to go back? Why on earth would we go back? We've learned so much during this period of time. What we're going to do is go forward, and we're going to go forward, I like alliteration, with 4 things. So post-pandemic, I think we're going to see a continued rise in trust. You could see that in Peter's opening, the authenticity with which he discussed the things that you need to address in the next 118 years. Transparency, where you discussed that you had a racial incident that you're addressing in real time. That's how you create an authentic relationship with not only your customers, but also your employees. Increasingly, we've seen more work being done in teams. 50% in pre-pandemic, we had a 50% increase in collaboration at work. I expect that to accelerate. We're going to talk about that more in the leadership section as well. And then telepresence is just simply here to stay as an embedded option, whether it's to see your doctor, take a class, or at times work from home. We'll see what percentage of the workforce goes back into the office every single day when we are able to. Now, I have marveled at the way we've developed vaccines. I am by no means an expert on it, but there's something about the process by which we've developed this vaccine that gives us a glimpse into the future and a tremendous amount of hope. So if you look at prior vaccines, the polio vaccine, for example, took 50 years to develop. On average, vaccines take 10 to 15 years. The fastest one prior to this was the mumps vaccine, which we did in 4 years. The coronavirus we did in 10 months. How did we compress that much time? Well, we started with the discovery phase. We had an unprecedented amount of global collaboration, public-private partnerships, 18 pharmaceutical companies. And then when it came to the development phase, we benefited from having 50 years of research into coronaviruses. We were able to use genomic sequencing this time. And the real breakthrough is you used computational immunology, which means we were allowed to game or simulate what the vaccine would do in the body using computers, so that when we got to testing and trials, we had a better sense of where we needed to focus. We've got 3 approved in the US, and we are soon going to be flooded with vaccines. That was the latest report I read this morning. The CDC wants to distribute 2 billion doses in 2021. That's going to require, outside of the J&J vaccine, incredible temperature control and GPS tracking and huge coordinations, public-private, to get vaccine coordination into the arms of people. If you look at this collectively, this gives me a tremendous amount of hope, not only from the science frontier and boom we're going to have over the next decade, but what's possible when we ignite the passion in humans towards a goal. This tells us what we're capable of, and I see so much brightness ahead because of this. So now let's go on to the next section. We're going to talk about adapting at the speed of change. We are again going through the greatest velocity of change in human history. At the same time, we're making our greatest leaps in human longevity. So, for example, if you were born, and not relevant to any of us, but if you were born back when the steam engine came out, when life expectancy was on average 37 years, you had two and a half generations to absorb the impact of that paradigm shifting change. Fast forward to today, depending on your age, you are going to have to go through at least one and maybe as many as four paradigm shifting changes within a single generation. We're not ready for that. We're not talking about that change enough, but we've started to with the pandemic. One of the other things that's happening is we are entering the fifth era in human history. The first was a hunter gatherer, followed by the agricultural era, the industrial era, the information era, and now we're in the augmented era. Each era is defined by a time span, and you'll notice each time span is getting shorter, closer together. How we value talent, first it was strength and speed, and now it's adaptability. It's how we use tools. We started using the very first hand tools for labor efficiency. We moved to labor augmentation. Now we're at cognitive augmentation. And then we had training and workforce prep, which initially was just mimicking other members of our clan or family, moved to formal training, and now we need to get to a place where we help people self-direct their own learning. So if we just sort of zero in, you'll see that we are here in time. We've crossed from the information era into the augmented era, but unfortunately our systems are stuck between the industrial and the information era. That is more of a mindset shift than anything we need to make. And if we zero in on between these two time periods, you see that the information era was really, most of us on this call probably have lived through it in our lives, or at least the majority of it, because it's only lasted decades. It's a big shift in talent. In the information era, it was acquired knowledge and skill. It was get a good degree, have stored knowledge you can draw on. Now we can access stored knowledge in different ways, so it's about our ability to adapt and create new value. Tools in the information era were things we had to learn in order to use. You had to learn to use Excel, Salesforce, you name the tool, you had to learn it in order to use it. Now we're learning from and with the tools. And workforce prep in the information era was really higher education or some sort of degree or certificate. Now, higher education or degree or certificate will still play a role, but it's really going to be much more about your own ability to continuously learn and adapt. Another thing that's taking place is a shift in corporate longevity versus human longevity. So at one time, human lifespans were longer than corporate lives, shorter than corporate lifespans. Now the inverse is true. A human is lasting many times longer than on average a corporation. What does that mean? It means you can't have your entire career within an organization. So the career arc becomes much longer now. And since the shelf life of skills is so much shorter, then we have to reskill repeatedly. And as you can see, your shelf life of skills, at least perishable skills, which we'll talk about, used to be enough to last an entire career. Now it's enough to fill a chapter in the book that will be the much longer book of your career. So humans think all species work in two modes. Exploration or cognition works in two modes, exploration and exploitation. So animals will explore to find a source of food, and if the berries in the bush over there are good, we'll deplete that source of berries until it's gone. Well, corporations work the same way. If you kind of look at the S-curve of value creation, we will explore to find a business model, we'll scale that business model, reduce our risk until the business model runs out. And so much of our energy has been spent on exploitation and scaling and much less on exploration. And between the two is the translation. And the thinking that goes into exploitation is very problem solving, scaling, and algorithmic. And those problems are well framed and well defined. What we really need is more folks to work in problem finding and problem framing using searchlight intelligence. Because if you look at these two things side by side, in sort of the old economy, you had a much longer S-curve than in the new reality. The new reality, those S-curves are shorter and much closer together because companies are not lasting as long, products and services are not lasting as long. So we need folks to work on the new frontier of building new products, new services, and new business models on a regular basis, which means more folks working in exploration, which is a completely different mindset. PricewaterhouseCoopers surveys CEOs to ask them what the most important skills are in this reality of exploration and exploitation. And then they talk about how difficult are these skills to find. Now, this is their 2000 survey. I have not seen their 2001 yet. Skills that are that are important, but they can find them, or not surprising, STEM skills, digital skills, risk management. But the skills that are really the most difficult to find and the most important, which they call the skills battleground, are problem solving, leadership, creativity and innovation, adaptability, collaboration, emotional intelligence. None of those are technical skills. Those are uniquely human skills, and we're going to talk about that. In 2018, those skills were number 5. In 2019, they became number 2. They continue to rise in popularity. I think in probably the 2020 and the 2021 surveys, we'll have pandemic and global recession as 1 and 2, but I expect talent to be in that top 5. So let's talk about those skills. As I said, there's 2 types of skills. There's technical skills, which we've been lunging at over the last couple of decades, and most notably around the third industrial revolution, which we're going to talk about. And that's because we needed to digitize our economy. We needed more folks with technical skills. Those technical skills used to last a decade, then they last 5 years. Latest estimate on this is that technical skills now last 2 to 3 years. And that's why IBM refers to them as perishable skills. And the human skills, which are the durable skills, they appreciate. So I have this expression that I say, tech skills appreciate, human skills appreciate, but we don't act like it. And it's not that we don't need those technical skills. We sure do. We need to repeatedly add and delete them like we do applications on our phone. And that's how we have to think about it. We've got to spend much more attention building those uniquely human skills that are transferable and that provide the foundation so you can add and delete the technical skills. So as I said, we're entering the 4th industrial revolution. The first was mechanical, defined by the steam engine. Second was electrical and mass production. The third was the internet, computer automation of physical labor, some of it anyway. And the 4th, which we're entering now, is digital convergence, so that everything around us has some intelligence in it, and some of it can operate autonomously without us. And that's a different thing. So in the first industrial revolution, it was learn a skill. Back then, only men worked primarily outside the home, so jobs were multi-generational. Second industrial revolution, it was sort of join a trade as we became more organized. You often worked in the same industry as your family. The third industrial revolution was that pick a good major, get a good job, climb the career ladder that many of us are still stuck in. And now it's really learn, adapt, and create new value, because most likely you're going to have to traverse a multi-industry career web. And when we talk about skills, I believe the skills gap, at least the technical skills gap, will never close. And that's something we should just accept and embrace in some ways. If the technical skills gap will never close, that means we're constantly forming new knowledge. It's a good thing. We're constantly advancing at a faster and faster pace. So we have to be better at wading in that world of what I call the skills abyss. So let's talk about sort of levels of skills. So first there's competence, and it got a little confused here, but that's a question pointing to an answer. Where someone gives you a known question, you give the right answer. That's competence. It's essentially performing a task to a benchmark level, and you're drawing on your existing knowledge. This was the domain of skilling or reskilling of the first and second industrial revolutions. Now, you fast forward, if you are capable, you have the ability to figure out which question of the known questions you can answer, and then the answer to that. And that's essentially the ability to translate your competence to new challenges, translate and potentially deepen your knowledge when you need to. This is what upskilling is all about. It was really the big domain of the third industrial revolution. What we're entering now is capacity. That is where you have to formulate the question as well as the answer. So the question's not given. You're finding and framing those new challenges. You're formulating new knowledge. And that is the domain of what I refer to as the human capital era. In the human capital era, we all have to reskill. We all have to upskill. We focus much more on building that sort of underlying human operating system that allows us to do so. So let's move on to the second part, where now we're going to ask you about your identity. So how do you define yourself? Because we're going to dive into some identity issues. And so let's see. First, how do you define yourself? First option is I'm always in the process of redefining myself, forever a work in progress. Other folks, my legacy. My current role is my identity. My legacy is my identity. My industry is my identity. So let's see here. So far, the majority of you are continuously redefining yourself, forever work in progress by a large margin. That's really cool. So next to that, it's legacy. Third place is current role. Fourth place is industry, and about 2% of you is none of the above. I see it sort of changing a little bit in percentages, but it looks like overwhelmingly at north of 70%, you're all in the process of redefining yourself forever, a work in progress. So, Jamie, I think that's good. Thank you. And now let's move forward on this section on identity. I realized a few years ago that we have been asking some really harmful questions. Stuff that worked in the third industrial revolution absolutely does not work today. So we ask little kids, what are you going to be when you grow up? An absurd question when the majority of work that they're going to do either doesn't exist yet or won't look anything like it does today. As Ginny Rometty from IBM says, 100% of jobs are going to change. If you believe the World Economic Forum report or any of the other projections, they've all been in the neighborhood of 40 to 50% of work tasks will be handed off to technology. That is therefore changing 100% of work. We ask university students to pick a major before they step foot on campus. That means I guarantee you I would not speaking to you folks if that were true for me, because it's asking folks to pick a future self based upon what you're told you're good at in high school. That doesn't mean what you're good at. It's what you're told you're good at, because high school is a very thin slice of life. I imagine most of you out there have been successful navigating a future that was much greater than what you were exposed to in high school. We ask university students to pick a major, and the only statistics I've seen on this, because there aren't very many studies on it, that less than a third of people ever work in the field of their undergraduate major, and those people who do are faculty. I always tell that when I speak to universities. I'm like, you guys aren't normal. And then the first thing we ask each other when we meet each other are, what do you do? Best research I've seen on this is by the Foundation for Young Australians, which used OECD and World Economic Data, which is essentially global data for folks in the first world. And they said that most of young people today in the developed world will have 16, 17 different jobs across 5 different industries. So it's much more important we help folks get an internal sense of purpose that will help them drive their own learning and the ability to traverse a much broader and longer career arc and career web. One of the ways to sort of frame this is kind of look at what most of us told when we were younger versus what's true today. I refer to this as the old paradigm, where life existed in 3 discrete bands: education, career, retire. Whether you went to university or not, learning was just that first third of your life, one and done, sufficient only to get you on that career ladder or job escalator, ride it up, collect your pension, and by design, a year later, that was by design, we picked retirement age just after life expectancy. And we were successful here. Did you codify and transfer the right predetermined skills and existing knowledge to get somebody on that escalator? That was the paradigm. It worked. Now, the arc is much longer. We may not all have a life expectancy of 90 yet, but we will soon. We're trending that way. Education becomes learning to imply there's no end state to that. Work becomes leverage to signify that work and learning are a combined act. And then longevity becomes a reality because we didn't plan for, save for, nor can we afford a 30-year retirement. Financially, most folks can't afford it, but we can't afford it cognitively or psychologically either. And so it looks much more like this. So it's really marked by, while we remain engaged, that success measures are, can you learn, adapt, and create new value? It's an easy thing to say. It's a really hard thing to do, especially when you're shifting out of that old paradigm and that old promise. People ask me all the time, you're a future work strategist, what's the skill of the future? I think the only skill of the future is the will to acquire multiple skills, the importance of being able to self-propel your own learning. Because we're all going to go through these cycles of learning, unlearning, upskilling, unlearning, reskilling, unlearning. And the way we do that is a connection to, what are you curious about? What do you feel passion towards? What do you feel ultimately is your purpose in life? Now, that's not something you're born knowing. Most of us are not. It's a process of discovery. It's put yourself in as many experiences as possible. Pay attention to what gives you energy. Because I think about it like an iceberg, and where we're lunging at those perishable skills, which are the skills to do, often the skills for which you're hired. And I think about it like an iceberg because that's what we can see. We're starting to pay more attention to what I call the enablers. Some people call them soft skills. They're uniquely human skills and traits that make you better at your job. You're rarely hired for them, but they make you better at your job. They also make you better in all your relationships. Like, you'd rather be around somebody who's got a better sense of empathy, or ability to communicate, ability to collaborate, and is creative. But we haven't focused enough because we've been lunging at those technical skills. Below that is what I call an agile learning mindset. It takes some of the tenets of Carol Dweck's growth mindset, but it focuses on how you adapt to rapidly changing market conditions. So it's a self-awareness about yourself as well as changing nature of the market. And then below that is a resilient adaptive identity that's connected to a sense of purpose. So if you lose your job changes, your industry changes, you still have a sense of who you are because it's a connection to your purpose, not any one role or outcome. And that agile learning mindset I mentioned, it's a connection to the heart and head. So it's not just cognitive, but it's also emotional. And it has 4 A's because I like alliteration, easier to remember. It starts with agency, understanding that learning is your responsibility, and understanding that connecting to your own motivation is the key to doing that. Understanding your sense of purpose. Then it's understanding learning agility, your ability to learn and unlearn. How do you learn was something you didn't need to know about when it was the first third of your life. But now, when it's the fuel source of your entire career, you got to pay attention to it. Then it's how adaptable are you? How do you deal with ambiguity and uncertainty? Moments just like this. And then the last piece of it, which I think is sometimes the most important, it's both your self awareness and your market awareness. Gone are the days where you can say, I don't know what my company does, but this is my little job. No, you have to understand how your company or your entity or your organization creates value, and every organization creates value, whether they're a for profit or nonprofit or a government organization. And then how do you contribute to that value creation? Because when your company or entity's business model changes, which it will inevitably, you need to change with it or ahead of it. And I think part of it is a change in perspectives. So I call this the I to the T to the X framework. So the I mindset was this is my discipline, this is my identity, this is my industry, and I only go into that, I only identify with that and with other folks. To the kind of idea of the T-shaped thinker that came up in the 90s, which was really I still have my strong discipline identity, but I have the ability to collaborate with some adjacencies. So in construction now, I might be an engineer, but I can coordinate with somebody in sales or I can coordinate with somebody in construction, to have it being a transdisciplinary thinker, which is really a solutions-based thinker, which not only is looking at it from multiple human disciplines, but also when you are finding and framing a new challenge, do you bring forward different disciplines to solve that problem, or do you decide whether or not technology would be used best? So it's a very different mindset, and I have some great examples of how to do that. So we're moving from stocks of knowledge to flows of knowledge. So you can't dine out on stocks of knowledge anymore. You have to work in flows of emerging knowledge. And one way to do that is to diversify your inputs. So during this coronavirus, a physicist in Japan, probably wonder why there's cotton candy machine right there. It's going to all make sense soon. A physicist in Japan was looking at a cotton candy machine and he said it makes unpredictable patterns when it spins that sugar, and that's actually what you really need in an N95 mask. So he drew up a way of using cotton candy machine to spin plastic instead of sugar, make plastic fibers, and he made a competitor to an N95 mask at a fraction of the cost with the same or greater efficacy, because the more nonlinear the fibers are, the more they're able to capture the respiratory droplets. Similarly, Dippin' Dots. Dipping Dots, if you don't have kids or if you're not a kid at heart like me, it's an ice cream treat you can get at science fairs and amusement parks and stuff like that. It's been around since the 80s. What it is little pellets of ice cream that are made through passing liquid ice cream through a colander through liquid nitrogen. So they form these very small little ice pellets that melt in your mouth and then sort of taste like ice cream once your tongue defrosts a little bit. Well, Dippin' Dots have to be shipped at negative 49 degrees Fahrenheit. So the folks who were looking at first shipping the Pfizer vaccine went, whoa, we can learn from the Dippin' Dots folks. And so they collaborated with the Dippin' Dots folks to discover how they were going to ship the Pfizer vaccine through the supply chain, GPS tracking, et cetera, because there can't be a moment of thaw in that process or all of what is now the most precious resource on Earth would have evaporated. So let's talk about how you lead in this normal with this all this going on. So first I want to ask you, what do you think is most important in a leader before we get into the leadership section? So the options here are ability to motivate and inspire, ability to learn and comfort with ambiguity and uncertainty, comfort with being wrong or corrected, which nobody likes. I understand that. Long record in the industry, market, or function, relevant degrees, credentials, or past experiences, or something not listed here. We've only been on this for a few seconds here, but it looks like motivate and inspire is number one with 70 some odd percent of you. And the ability to manage comfort with ambiguity and uncertainty is right up there, and comfort with being wrong or corrected. Those look like the top answers. I'll give it another second, but it looks like the top three by far are ability to motivate, ability to learn, comfort with ambiguity, and comfort with being wrong or connected. So Jamie, we can take that down. Thank you. So in this new normal, leadership shifts, as I said, from top down to drive productivity, which used to be kind of depersonalized. Everybody was treated like a depersonalized unit of productivity. It was demanding. Motivation was external, kind of carrots and sticks. Now we're looking at inspiring potential, bottom up, personalized, thinking about the folks on your team. How do you coach them? How do you help them get connected with their own internal sense of motivation, which I think is curiosity, passion, and purpose. The reality is you will not know everything. We're moving from a world that was complicated, whether if you developed products and this is how they were assembled, or you think about how organizations, humans are assembled, where the person at the top has the knowledge of everybody they manage. So now increasingly it looks like this, whether it's from a product standpoint or a service standpoint or a human organizational standpoint. I've used these frameworks across a number of talks now, across a number of industries. An executive at a very large media company came up to me and she said, that's exactly what I'm going through. They just reorganized the company and everybody who reports to me has knowledge and skill I don't have. And it can cause a crisis of confidence. It can cause an imposter syndrome. But the reality is, even though people have knowledge and skill you may not have, they don't have the ability to orchestrate and lead that you do. So you have to be open to learning from others. And I know it's a huge shift for a lot of folks, but moving from complicated to complexity means that we have to change our decision-making process much more. Listening is involved. Now I want to talk to you about chickens. So we've had cotton candy and Dippin' Dots. Now we're going to talk about chickens. So if you like this information, it's a really great TED Talk by Margaret Heffernan called Forget the Pecking Order at Work. It's a TED Talk. I recommend it. But this is research by Dr. William Muir, who was an evolutionary biologist at Purdue. And he wanted to study whether or not we could breed hyperproductivity into animals. He wanted to study and see if we could do it with humans as well. And so he did this with chickens. I ended up talking with him for my book. He said he did it across almost every animal species that he could since the 1980s, with these results being exactly the same. Chickens are easy because you can count the eggs. Hens rather, so we can count the eggs. And he said he put chickens in flocks of 9, and every time they went through a couple life cycles, he would pull out the hen that was the most productive, the one that laid the most eggs, and put that together in a flock of super chickens or super hens to see if he could increase productivity. And what he found was really interesting. Not only did it not increase productivity, but at the end of the day, only 3 of the 9 chickens were alive. The rest had pecked each other to death. And what he discovered through this experiment, which I think is true in many organizations, is that we tend to focus on the stars. And the stars, whether it's in a flock of chickens or a group of humans, often only becomes the star by suppressing the productivity of the rest of the group, sometimes by bullying. So I say, are you creating a super chicken Hunger Games at work? It's because so much of work, and certainly innovation, happens not only with the individuals, but what happens between the groups. That's why we have to think differently about it. Google wanted to understand this as well. This research, honestly, is a few years old, but it's becoming increasingly relevant. Google asked in their Project Aristotle, I think it was like 3 or 4 years ago, and they said, everything we do is learning, essentially. And we're a technology company, but technology company is really a learning company. And if we look across all the projects that we're working on, all the innovation projects, which are learning projects, and we use all the data that we have, and they wanted to understand what made for the highest performing learning teams. They had 180 teams. They worked over 2 years. Was it collective IQ? Was it time in the industry? Was it same gender, same culture, different culture? Was it people who knew each other? They found that the number one determinant of success in accelerating learning, accelerating innovation, was first and foremost establishing something called psychological safety, which is a term coined by Dr. Amy Edmondson from Harvard. Psychological safety is setting the conditions on your team so that everyone feels comfortable saying, hey, wait a second, I have a question. Hey, wait a second, I question the direction we're going in. I want to add to that. It's the ability to feel comfortable saying, I need help, I have a question, I respectfully agree or disagree. It has to also be met with dependability where everybody's accountable, nobody's checking out. Clarity of what you're trying to do. Everyone has clarity. There's not a lot of ambiguity on it. What you're trying to do has meaning in the world and it connects to your own sense of purpose. That's sort of the magic 5, but psychological safety had to be there as number 1. The reason I use this picture of actually the world's oldest trapeze artist, Betty Godot from San Diego, was increasingly, I think this is what work feels like. As more and more of us have to do work that's never been done before, it's going to feel like leaping from a trapeze, and you got to provide folks a net, and that's what I think psychological safety does. Dr. Alison Reynolds and Dr. David Lewis at London Business School also believed that psychological safety was an essential thing to accelerate learning and innovation, but they said it also has to be, according to their research, also has to be met with cognitive diversity. Cognitive diversity means simply picking people who think differently than you do, sometimes even when they make you uncomfortable. So they say teams fall into 4 quadrants. Defensive teams have low diversity, low safety. It's a CYA team. You've all been on them. It's uncomfortable. Largely, it's dysfunctional. Then you have teams that are oppositional, where you've maybe got 1 or 2 people who think differently. Often they're bullies. Those oppositional teams can be marginally functional. The teams too many of us form are uniform, which means we pick people who think like we do. We all get along, we all hug, nothing really changes because nobody wants to challenge anybody. The teams we really want to form are generative. They have high diversity and high safety, so you're making everybody feel safe and respected, but you're encouraging people to speak up. So when you're forming a team and you're thinking about that person kind of irritates you, they always ask something you hadn't thought of. Think about bringing them on your team. They may accelerate your learning. So we're in a reality check. COVID is the crisis we know about. What's a crisis? What's the next crisis? There will inevitably be one that we do not know about yet. There's a way to think about this. I think we have to get used to uncertainty. We have to get used to stretching in new ways. We have to get used to being uncomfortable. We have to get comfortable being wrong. We have to be comfortable not knowing. We have to be comfortable with first times, like this giraffe learning to walk. And increasingly, I think that's our navigation out of uncertainty. The other thing is we need an approach to dealing with uncertainty as a norm, and it's a combination of a perspective, a process, and priorities. So the perspective is, how do I, instead of just having that static 3 to 5 year plan, how do I zoom into what I need right now in the next 3 weeks or 3 months? How do I zoom out, look further out on the horizon, the trends that might be emerging that weren't emerging when you wrote that static 3-year document long ago, because time is continuing to accelerate. From a process standpoint, we can't just assume the steps are going to work sequentially as planned. You folks know those buildings, all sorts of things can go wrong. You got to think forward to your goal and then think backwards. So all the contingencies that could take place and how are you going to work around them? And then from a priority standpoint, I think we need to focus much more on our teams and our customers. So how do I create new value for my customers? How do I unleash the potential of my teams? That focus on what is essentially creating a culture of learning and a capacity for continued growth will serve you well, because when you think about it, all the products and services we have are simply exhaust from our learning. So where do we go from here? The road ahead. Some interesting things are going on. I have declared this the human capital era, and here is why. So if you look at how value is created, from 1970 to 2019, we were in what was called the shareholder value era. Milton Friedman declared that in 1970 in an article in the New York Times. He said the singular purpose of a company or a corporation, a firm, is to return profits to shareholders at all costs. Well, we've done that. And in that process, we have extracted value from physical assets. So this is using the S&P 500 in 1935. 100% of the value we created was from personal property, plant, and equipment. In 1975, that became 83%. In 2016, the last time we calculated, it became 16%. Where did the value actually come from since then? The 17% in 1975 and the 84% in 2016, it came from humans. Now, even in the construction business, you're building things, but it's the people who are making the difference. So I declare this the human capital era. And here's why. The SEC declared in November that all financial documents for public companies going forward should include human capital, because we're starting to realize it's not physical products. It's not even buildings, as wonderful as they are. It's not technology. It's humans that create the value. So the greatest investment you can make is in humans. And increasingly, I think we're shifting from a mindset of me to a mindset of we. The reason I use this picture, this is 47 people on a surfboard in Long Beach, California. Guinness Book of World Records in 2015. They lasted 12 seconds, God bless them. This is what I think work is going to increasingly feel like. My movement's going to affect your movement. You could flip me off the board. I could flip you off the board. We've got to balance together. Because the only way we're going to get through this pandemic is when we establish herd immunity. That's when the virus is denied a host. That means I get vaccinated for me, but I get vaccinated for you. I wear a mask for me, I wear a mask for you. I distance for me, I distance for you. We think about the collective because we don't know where the virus can harbor. As I said, we've had a 50% increase in collaboration at work. I believe that'll continue to accelerate, particularly as we use more technology. And it brings up the African proverb, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I think this pandemic has been a moment that's fast forward us at least 5 years forward, but it gives us the opportunity to pause and think. We put the humans at the center of all we do. We focus on learning. We focus on human potential. We're going to go further together. And with that, I want to wrap up, and we can I can take any questions you have. First, here's my mantra: learning is the new pension. It's how you create your future value every day. I have the ABL, always be learning mindset, because learning is the only sustainable competitive advantage. In order to do this, we've got to let go of old ways, identity, and embrace vulnerability. The way we've always done it, who we think we are, to get a comfort with, I don't know yet, let's find out. Leading these adaptive teams requires a different approach. Establish psychological safety, get comfortable with vulnerability, focus purpose to help your teams self-propel, and focus on engagement. And the road ahead, I think our brightest days are ahead of us. We're going to go into a new form of Roaring 20s that is going to be more sustainable and more equitable. It's a shift from me to we, because I think the human capital era is here. And with that, I thank you very much for what is your only non-renewable resource, which is your time, for sharing some of it with me. And I would be happy to answer any of your questions.
So, Heather, thank you so much. I paused there because there's just so much to absorb. I read your book, know about you, we've talked, but what you laid out was just absolutely amazing. Absolutely recommend, because of that, we don't nearly have enough time to cover this, all the sort of the deep thinking you've done into this subject. Recommend people would go to Amazon, buy your book, The Adaptation Advantage, and really sort of read that with others, because we actually have sort of a culture of doing some, sort of like book clubs in the company, and we encourage people to probably to get books and read that to absorb it. There's a lot to cover here, and we only have a little bit more time. There's a ton of questions. I do want to, I guess, touch on a couple things, I guess, from my standpoint, because this is very timely. We as a company have been thinking about these topics long before COVID, how to create a coaching environment versus a sort of managerial or traditional managerial type environment, how to encourage people to be agile, to be lifelong learners, to actively care. But there's always a tension. And I want to get, this is an internal event, so I want to have honest conversations. It's a bit of a tension. We talk about, and you talk about psychological safety. We want people to feel safe, but yet we also encourage people to feel uncomfortable. How do you find that balance? How do you find that balance of bringing diverse perspectives that make people uncomfortable, but make everybody feel safe, so that we can absorb and learn and benefit from each other?
That's a great question. And honestly, the number of times I've discussed these topics, nobody's framed it quite that way. So thank you. I love it when I get a new question. One of the things I always say to folks when I'm answering questions is, I'm not going to bullshit with you. If I don't know the answer, I'm happy to say I don't know the answer. That's one I haven't thought about in that way, but I think one of the things you can think about is, as long as you're being respectful to the individual, you're not violating them in their sense of self or their place in the world in any way. You want people to feel a little uncomfortable. Let's face it, our biggest growth moments, think of all the things we've learned the most, was probably the hardest moments of your life. So you want to create sort of that discomfort in the moment, but you want them to feel the safety in the longer term. So if you want them to feel uncomfortable in the moment, so they let go of an old way of doing something, they learn something new, they accept something about themselves. We all have biases. Um, you've got to create that friction, but at the same time, you also have to give them. I mean, think about it like many of you folks are parents. There are moments where you give your kids a timeout, you take something away from them, you know it's hurting them because they're upset and they're crying, but you know that you fundamentally love them and that they have a safe place. You've got to have sort of that parental approach where you make them uncomfortable so they correct their behaviors and they learn and they grow, but at the same time, you don't rock their core sense of self and safety.
That's great. Thank you. Actually, I'll push a question that somebody's been asking, because again, we've got a ton of questions, and I'm being selfish by asking my own question. But so there's a question we also grapple with as an industry, because not for nothing, construction is perceived as very traditional, sort of a little bit old school, muddy boots kind of industry. And we're trying to increase the diversity of perspectives in the pipeline that come into the industry, come into the company. What do you think what needs to change in the educational system to prepare for that next generation, and so that we can start thinking as a company, what can we do to encourage that change in education?
Well, I honestly said to you folks during the talk that I would not be speaking to you if it were based upon my high school career. So we've created a system that sort of weeds people into buckets. We tell some people you're university material. We tell some people we're not university material. We tell some people they're smart. We tell some people they're athletic. And for some folks, that becomes a trap their whole lives. What we need to do is help folks get in touch with their own sense of motivational drive, what they're interested in. Some of the best, and by the way, I spent a decade in higher ed, and I've got the scars to prove it, trying to make some of these changes at the higher ed level. I think we actually have to start at the K-12 level. One of the most interesting experiments I've seen on that front is the folks who created Khan Academy created a lab school for their own children, where they said, everybody's going to work through competencies. We're going to organize people by independence, not by age, because that's as arbitrary as organizing people by height. Everyone's going to be a teacher and a learner. Everyone's going to have a passion projects. So I met with these kids, and they were young children, and they were telling me what they're working on. They were telling me what they were teaching. They were all fired up. I mean, Gallup has done studies. 74% of preschool kids are engaged about learning. 34% of high school kids are. Children are, people are. What we do is we wring all the enthusiasm out of it because we focus on telling people what they're good at and, more importantly, what they're not good at. And that is such a thin slice of life, and there's very little room to explore. So what we need to do is help folks get connected to their own interests and their own, because they're going to have to self-propel, go through a lot of learning on their own, get them own connected to their own motivational drive. The other thing we need to do is, if you're talking about the construction industry, is we need folks that look different. And we need representative change. So we need organizations that have leaders that look like the organizations they're leading. So more people say, oh, I fit there because that looks like me, or that feels like me, or that person interacted like I interacted. Not that we need to create harmonious cultures, but we need to embrace that diversity and inclusion that Peter was talking about at the beginning, so that we get more folks in your organizations, or particularly in leadership, that look like the teams you want to be leading, look like our society.
Well, along those lines, just to address one part of this, Eric had asked a question about anticipating problems in adapting to the speed of change, given some of our societal institutions, schools, and stuff. I mean, should we feel like we need to wait for society to catch up? Is there to what extent can we drive change as a company just by ourselves, if this is what we care about?
You can reflect upon what it's going to be a year. I think March 12th is when the global pandemic was officially declared. So it's going to be a year this week. Reflect on what you've done in the past year. I look closely at the higher ed sector because I did work there for a decade, and I'm seeing a lot of institutions change, close, merge. So ones that had perpetuated a model that was very outdated from a cost standpoint and et cetera, couldn't adapt. So this pandemic has been, as horrible as it has been a gift in some ways, because it has fast forwarded our need to evolve some institutions, whether it's the racial unrest that made us aware of things we should have been paying attention to before, or essential workers that we didn't have gratitude before, but we do now. There's a lot of silver linings in there. And I think the pandemic has been great in that regard, to getting us to look more closely at some of the things that really weren't working for a majority of folks.
So along those lines, we talk about, say, external societal changes. So, I did start saying, Turner's been looking at ourselves. We've been adapting, we've been evolving, we've been changing, but we still are caught in some respects internally in some tensions around traditional thinking versus what the pandemic's sort of forcing us to rethink. So so say an employee who maybe newer to the company, maybe a little bit junior, how should they deal with maybe managers or others in leadership that don't see things the same way, and how do they navigate that tension where some people might be still in that traditional way of thinking, and you've still got some people that are coming at it a new different way? How do we balance those tensions again inside the organization?
Well, if you're talking about the person who's resistant to some remote work, not that 100% of work needs to be remote, it's not the solution for everything. But this, what I call it, a forced social experiment we went through for the last year, has taught us what works and what doesn't work. And even some of the leaders I speak to who are absolutely resistant to any form of remote work have said, some of this is actually working pretty well. Is to ask that leader, that manager, and say, well, what do you think works and what doesn't work? What are your reservations? And if the reservation is trust, if you don't trust somebody, why did you hire them? If you don't trust somebody to work autonomously, don't hire them. If you feel you need to create social capital with people, I totally get that. And one of the things I've seen some companies talk about is maybe we don't have a big office that everybody has to go into. Maybe we have satellite offices that people go into. Some people need places to go. But maybe we have regular in-depth retreats where we get to know each other and we develop some of that social capital. We develop virtual rituals around that to develop some of that social capital. But if it's, I don't like remote work because I don't trust people, don't hire people you don't trust.
That's great. That's a very honest assessment of how we should be looking at the organization. So we only have about a minute left. I'm going to ask you a very unfair question in some respects because it's so broad. But you talk about people. You very much talk about the individual skills, upskilling. So as an organization, is it fair to say that again we need to build a level of resiliency in the organization? Because again, COVID was, as some would call it, a black swan event. That term for the completely unexpected that you'd never have planned for. Those will happen again in the future. What does that organization look like? What does that organization have to look like? What are the characteristics? What would you look for to say this is a resilient organization that can adapt to the next, for Turner, the next 118, 119 years? What might that look like for you? If you had to summarize.
Yeah, so there are no unfair questions. I'll do the best I can with any question you throw in my direction, and undoubtedly I'm going to learn from them. Whenever people use the word resilience, I always make sure it's paired with the word adaptability, because some people can look at resilience to persist on doing things the way they've always done them, even when it doesn't work. So when you pair it with adaptability, it is, what is our North Star? Why do we as an organization exist? How does the world look differently because we exist? What is it that we truly believe, and how do we check those beliefs in terms of the things we're trying to do to change the world in the way we were trying to change it? So if Turner is are you in the business of construction? Are you in the business of built environments? Are you in the business of habitation? How do you define what you do? How do you make that sort of dent in the universe? What are the things you believe that you will and won't do to achieve that, what is essentially a mission and a vision? Those are the things I would ask back to you to think about how you define yourselves. Because a lot of times we've defined ourselves by what we used to do, realizing that we actually don't do that anymore. Most of what we do is solutions based. Most of what we do is thinking beyond the building, but what happens around the buildings? What impact does it have to traffic? What impact does it have to water? What impact does it have for climate? What is our goal as an organization? How do we want to change the world? What is our vision? What is our mission? And what do we believe, and how do we track people based upon those beliefs? Because they're going to learn along with you as your business model continues to evolve.
That's great. That's a wonderful way to end it. Thank you very much. Again, it was fantastic. We had 1,000 questions. We couldn't get to them. But again, I would absolutely recommend people go look for your book, The Adaptation Advantage, on Amazon, and dwell upon that, because I think you've given us a lot to think about. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.